Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session today, From Empathy to Understanding to Action, Mapping COVID-19 Across Disciplines. Today, we'll explore how investigating contemporary global pandemics can provide opportunities for middle and high school students to develop global competence and cultivate empathy through perspective taking. We'll focus specifically on a four-tiered multidisciplinary approach to investigate COVID-19, but the approach can really be applied to any global issue. You'll leave today with ready-to-use activities, free online resources, and a pattern of inquiry that will develop agency in your students and engage them in interdisciplinary exploration. We're joined today by Emily Veris, who is a teacher of biology and theory of knowledge at an international school in the Netherlands. Emily will be our presenter today. And we're also joined by Veronica Boix Mansilla, who is a principal investigator at Harvard Graduate School of Education's Project Zero. And Veronica will be our discussant. I'm Philippa Rappaport. I'm an educator at the Smithsonian Center for Learning and Digital Access, which is the department behind the Smithsonian Learning Lab. And we're also joined behind the scenes by another educator at Skilda, Tess Porter, who, when she's not presenting in one of these events, she has this knack for making everything seem seamless, and she's already been doing that today. So I'll just give a brief introduction to the lab and where we're headed today. Then I'll hand it off to our guests, who will model some transferable activities and techniques, and then we'll open it up to a larger discussion. Today's session, this interactive webinar, is part of a series of professional development webinars that focus on techniques to use digital museum resources for learning. So this is our May schedule. You can find the full schedule at the link at the bottom to the help page. You can see we offer a variety of ways to help you. We have a series that's called Getting Started and Creating Collections, and that's really about the hands-on tools to use the lab. We also have drop-in online office hours. Those are Tuesday, May 4th, Tuesday, May 18th. And then we have today's session, which is a cultivating learning session, and we have another one at the end of the month. Today's session will be archived. If you'd like to watch it again later or share it with a friend, you can access the archive on the Help Center along with the other archived sessions, including the ones listed here. The Learning Lab is a free online platform where you can discover digital museum resources from across the Smithsonian and beyond. You can create interactive learning experiences with them and share your discoveries and creations with others. We'll be sharing a few of these resources on the lab today, and you can find the links to the lab and the resources in the description of this video. And we'll also put those links in the chat. The Help Center isn't just a place to find upcoming and archived webinars. Here, you'll also find step-by-step instructions to do essentially everything on the lab, from searching for resources to building your own collections for use with students. Today's session is meant to be interactive, so we really invite you to send us your questions as they come up. If you're joining us by YouTube, you can find that over on the right side of your screen. If you're joining us by Facebook, you can add it into the comments section. So please, please, please send us your questions. So to start us off, we'd like to ask all of you a question. So here's our question. A local museum in your area is curating a temporary exhibition to encapsulate the impact of the pandemic in your community. What are you personally connected to and would consider loaning to the museum to be part of their display? So I'll just leave this up there and you can pop your answers into the chat, and then I'll turn it over to Emily.
I'll start us off and give some examples of what I might place into this curated exhibition. This past summer, we were unable to travel outside of the Netherlands where we live, my family. And so what we did instead was we cycled around the Netherlands with a kid in tow and our tent and strapped everything to our bikes. So I would bring and give to this local exhibition our cycle map from where we went. Philippa, would you like to share? Or Veronica?
I can add to that. I think that I would bring two things to the museum. I would donate a meditation cushion because COVID has really invited me to begin to learn more and more about meditating, and I have found that incredibly healing, incredibly centering, and I've loved that. And I also would bring a ticket to Argentina. I'm from Argentina originally. I live in the United States, and I was very anxious about seeing my mother. So as soon as I could fly to see her, I was incredibly happy. So I kept that ticket, actually. Philippa, what would you bring to the museum?
Well, one thing the pandemic has not cured me of is my indecisiveness. So first I thought of all kinds of cooking implements, like this pretty basket that we've been rising dough in that leaves this imprint on the dough. But I also kind of want to make a chart of the air quality in DC because it has been so clean and we've all been walking so much. So those are mine.
Thank you for sharing. Some interesting exhibitions that people are sharing in the comments. Some journal and asking their students to journal. Comfort food and different recipes. I feel like a lot of my friends were doing exciting cooking and sourdough bread. I feel like everyone was making. We did not venture into sourdough bread making. So we didn't take that leap during the pandemic. Thank you for sharing your curated personal connections. I wanted to turn our attention to kind of the arc of what my students and I explored when we were investigating the global implications of COVID-19. And the image you see on the screen is the map that my students created and designed on their own on how they wanted to communicate what they learned during this exploration of COVID-19. It's quite large, so it's impossible to read all the fine writing on there, but we'll explore pieces of this map. Really, this pandemic has impacted all parts of the world in all corners and in many different ways. And the ripple effects of these complications have really shown a spotlight onto inequity and many global issues at hand. So for me, as we started in person in the Netherlands, it was important for my students to have the time in order to explore some of these consequences. It does link with my curriculum as an IB diploma biology teacher in terms of all kinds of things. But most specifically, we were looking at infectious disease, which is why I was exploring COVID-19. But really, this could be used for any global issues. It doesn't have to be infectious disease. Ultimately, I wanted them to have an opportunity to think critically and consider what changes in their own lives or what changes in the community might be warranted as we look towards this post-pandemic world. I've done a map like this before with Ebola and with Zika, so the mapping idea wasn't anything new to me. However, I turn it over to my students, and my students do the majority of the planning as to what they're curious about, as we'll explore today. This happened to be this year's group of grade 12 students from IB Diploma Biology in their year 2. So it is some of the language that they're using is certainly high school language. So I'll talk a little bit about the process now and the steps of what we started with. And the first piece, as we move into how I did this, it was to consider different perspectives and empathy. And my students explored this in a variety of ways. I've taken a few screen grabs of some of the videos, and all of these are found in the collection that we'll share at the end of this presentation. But I wanted them to consider and interact with perspectives that they perhaps didn't think about in the beginning, not just children, but of their own age, but of varying age groups from different parts of the world, as well as different fields of work. The one video on the right happens to be an ice cream truck in New York City. It's in the collection as well. And then from there, I asked them to develop a good question, to think about what it was they wanted to explore, what they were curious about, and then consider, who could I ask in order to answer that question? What expert do I need to look towards? And what resources could I use that are reputable? So really developing those skills of considering sources that aren't biased, as well as what it takes to create an evidence-based set of answers to the question they wanted to explore. Many of them selected questions that were relevant to other courses that they were taking. I listed 4 of the questions there on the screen that my students had explored. Ethics, how do we know, and how do we decide about when do we open and how do we open and who gets a ventilator. Many really thoughtful questions were put forward. I then asked them to do some research and come up with some takeaways, and that's when the mapping came to fruition. And they mapped their takeaways. And then we spent some time just looking at the intersections and connections that they had drawn between, vaccines and technology and socioeconomics and culture and government and geopolitics. Remember, these are 12th graders. So geopolitics is a thing for them. And I asked them to do some thinking about what solutions could we find and what maybe further questions could be asked based on those intersections. And we'll spend some time on each parts of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 here. And I asked them to reflect at the very end, and we will also do some reflecting together. So if we transition on into a little bit of thinking about developing empathy and considering perspectives, then we're going to start with the same image that I showed my students and use this particular thinking routine. So it's called See, Feel, Wonder. And the image comes on the screen. I want you to think about, okay, as you observe it, what do you see? What feeling does this image evoke for you? And then what do you wonder? And instead of just wondering about the image, I'm going to ask if you could think about this image within the larger kind of global context of COVID-19 and build on this image as a starting point to inquire about the global health crisis as a whole, and how this virus has caused all kinds of lasting changes or adjustments or things that we've noticed. So I'm asking, what do you wonder about? So I'm going to give you some time, and we'll put the image up on the screen. Please feel free to share what you're thinking in the chat.
There's often a lag from when the question is posed to when it comes in the chat, so never fear, the answers are coming.
I'll start kind of sharing out because we have two different sets of comments coming in and not everyone can see everyone else's comments. Comments about a tunnel and the fear that it evokes, shadows, an image on the television, perhaps being a Greek structure or the Parthenon. I see the days getting longer. I feel that. Faded image of people off to the man's left, a lot of red, making you feel uneasy, the interior of a room, and someone sitting on a bed looking at something, question mark. Yes, it's a bit tricky to see. Faded images of people off to the man's left, and we're noticing quite a bit. And lucky for the Smithsonian Learning Lab allows you to zoom in to the images as well, and still see a really nice kind of high quality of the detail of the artwork. Yeah, it's certainly a structure in the image, and whatever that is, a television or a computer screen, it is. This particular image is a lot of red, and when I showed this to my students, they were really quite enthralled. Maybe that's the wrong word. Curious about might be a better word, as to how many people were actually in the room. And they would come up to the projector and just peer, because in the center you can see that there's these, like someone mentioned, faded images, but it's unclear as to how many people are there and in what orientation they're lying. And they were quite interested in that. And the feelings, if we transition into now what we feel, one of you had already mentioned fear in terms of what that evoked for you, or uneasiness in terms of the color and the red that's being used. This is actually a screen print. So I can only imagine the layers of screen printing that this particular artist had selected in order to create this image. So I'll give you a minute to see if there's any other feelings out there. Isolation. Lots of questions about what is exactly represented. So people may feel a little bit unsure about what this image's purpose or the intention of the artist might be. And if we think about anxiety as well, quite not very pleasant emotions that this image is bringing up. And my students had also considered the posture of the person, and they were trying to work out what it exactly was that he or she, they assumed a he, I guess, but not everyone said he in their comments. What exactly they were sitting on. They thought it looked more like a bed than a couch, but who knows? People have all kinds of cool couch structures these days. So, but the arms in and the kind of slightly hunched over position made them really feel that this person wasn't feeling particularly great in that situation. So let's transition to the questions. Wondering, what do we wonder about? And remember, we're trying to transition, not just asking about the artist or the artist intention, but really how does this particular image link to the overarching ideas about COVID-19 or the global crisis at hand, and what questions you might have about those ripple effects or about the inquiring about the global health crisis in general.
I can throw out some wonders while we're waiting for some to come in the chat. For me, I'm wondering what is causing what seems to me to be such intensity as he's peering at the screen. He seems to be watching it, with complete full attention. And what is he watching?
Go ahead. You go first, Veronica.
I can build on Philippa's comment. It made me wonder, what is the psychological impact and the long-lasting psychological impact of this global pandemic on young people? What do we know about that, and what will be necessary in order to curtail, work with the consequences of the pandemic?
I was going to bring up something similar to that in questioning our need for contact and how important. I was wondering in terms of a question form, right? Like what is really most important in terms of maintaining that contact, right? It's clear that text messages and phone calls and Zoom or FaceTime or whatever is not enough. So, how can we facilitate in the future better ways of not only in a sci-fi kind of way maintaining contact, but better ways of ensuring that this kind of global pandemic has an opportunity to learn, what can we do in the future to prevent something like this? Some questions. Will we ever forget how much we need each other? Which is really hits to the heart of the matter about the interconnectedness of humans, and how important it is to really be with someone in a space and share that space with them in a physical way, versus teaching online or working remotely. These kinds of issues. So if we think about what my students were asking and kind of transition back to what I had asked my students to do, I had used this as a starting point, this particular image as a starting point for the exploration, just to get them thinking about different perspectives and looking at an image a different way and not just seeing a work of art for what it is. Right? I had asked them to start with this particular image simply because it for me, it evoked enormous reminders about what life was like in isolation. For my students, what the next step is after looking at this particular image, I asked them to consider the questions that they had brought up and then focus those questions. And I used a couple different thinking routines to do this, and you can either practice this on your own, or you can consider fine-tuning that question and sharing it in the chat. But I asked my students to select one of their curiosities or wonders and come up with their own questions to ask. And remember, this is in a science class, but not all of them were, as 12th graders, not all of them were interested in studying science in the future. So many of their questions were rooted in their own personal level of interests, like film or technology or economics. Of course, some of them did end up exploring vaccines and healthcare and virology, but many of them are interested in the kind of global politics field. So I asked them to focus their question, and I'm going to ask you to do the same. So in your wonder, whether you shared it in the chat or you wrote it on your own, or you saw someone else's question or heard me share a question, I want you to edit your chosen wonder and really think about focusing that question, choosing a particular perspective from which to ask that question. and then making it relevant to something that you really want to know more about. And this is what I asked my students to do as well. So while you're thinking about how you would want to edit your question or your wonder, I'll share the thinking routines that I used in my classroom. There are 2 great thinking routines to help students come up with questions. And one is just generating as many questions as you can and really thinking about the wording of them later, but listing those questions and then sorting them by theme or by area of interest or some kind of intersectionality. And then connecting those questions, and maybe there's some relevancy between one area and one theme or another, and then elaborating on those questions. And what that does is it really helps the students either broaden or narrow, depending on what they want to do, their question, but make it so that you could pull between 2 different areas of study and look at the intersectionality or link in 2 different topics together to come up with a question that really explores the far-reaching consequences of what you would like to explore. But also the 3 whys, which is another thinking routine I quite like. Why does this matter to me? Why does this matter to the people around me? I chose particularly the school community. I asked them to comment on that. And then the world in general. So that helps them to really think about why is this a question that I should ask, and how does it impact my community, and how does it impact the world? And that helps them to fine-tune their question. So perhaps it's slightly more open-ended and really encapsulates the perspective they want to explore. Some lovely questions coming in. How do we create moments of connection and empathy-based responses and gatherings involving music and the arts? Oh, the arts, such a powerful movement to explore COVID, which is exactly what we're doing. What techniques are people using to move forward from this difficult time? Absolutely. My students, as I had already shared, some of their questions were really grappling with, how do we decide who gets a ventilator? How can we make sure that at this point in time there was no vaccine, right? But how can we make sure that the process of developing a vaccine is transparent and it's available to everyone, which is of course still a relevant question now in terms of rolling out vaccines. So hopefully you've had an opportunity to think about your own question and how you might want to edit those questions. So what my students then did after focusing the question was to select resources. And what I had asked them to consider is, who would they turn to in order to answer those questions? What expert, if they could interview any expert in the world in order to get a perspective to answer their question, who would they interview? What websites would they turn to that are reputable? And how would they make that distinction? So there's some skills in there that they had to grapple with. So think to yourself, and feel free to share in the chat, whose perspective might be needed to answer your question, and who's the expert? Is there an expert? The larger question of what might make someone an expert when it comes to the thoughts and feelings of such a isolating pandemic. As well as what might my peers know about this question? Are there other students that I could ask in my school or in my family group or in my sports or religious or cultural affiliate groups? Who could I turn to share some of those perspectives? Feel free to share. As you think about who you might turn to, my students were, of course, all wanting to ask Dr. Fauci a million questions. But being based in the Netherlands, they were very keen to ask the health ministry as it is here, why certain decisions were made as to, the type of lockdown that we had in the Netherlands, which was very different from France and Italy. It was the restrictions were significantly less. And so they had some very geographic-based questions to ask about COVID-19. Interesting. Were other pandemics isolating? What other ways can we do things in this world? It would be super interesting to be able to go back in time and interview people as to how that worked we're so connected via the internet. How must that have worked? Must have been terrifying, truly. In terms of the other questions and resources, I had asked them, afterwards to based on those resources, do a little bit of research. And so in the next part, which was mapping, I had asked my students to, take 3 takeaways, because of course, when you're researching something about infectious disease, you can really go down the rabbit hole, and you can do the same for anything. If you're mapping voting rights, or if you're mapping, climate change, there are just an innumerable amount of issues that you could bring up. So I asked them to fine tune it and select just 3 takeaways after doing their research and gathering their expert perspectives about what should be shared with our school community. And it's those 3 takeaways that the students have drawn out or written out. There's a few graphs and charts and pictures on here on this map. And so the map piece, they each drew their own section, and then you'll see some close-ups later on, but there are lots of lines that connect all over the map. And those lines and those intersections, they wrote little messages where they explained why, the vaccines was connected with economics, and why culture and economics and geopolitics, and in terms of who gets resources and all of this. And we'll explore some of that later. But those are the messy lines in there are really the best part of this particular rather large map. This particular map, like I said, is COVID-19, and when we will certainly look at some of the fine details, but I also did the map for Zika and Ebola, and I'll share those images at the very end. So I wanted to turn just to look at a few fine details of the map and some of these intersections. Again, it's written in quite small pen, so I drew a line as to where they are located on the map, but I typed them out since it's impossible to read, or if you wanted to read it, you would get no context as to where it is. So there's 2 slides, and we'll start with this one to spend a little bit of time thinking about those intersections. And this, I think, is the most exciting part about mapping, because the students are obviously going to be interested in exploring something from their own perspective with their own question. But when they start to realize the connections between their interests and other student interest, more questions arise, or opportunities for conversation or dialogue or critical thinking. This is really where it can get very interesting, especially if you choose a very global issue or problem. So the first one I wanted to point out is a connection between economics, geopolitics, public health, and vaccinations, which are all headlines that my students had explored. And the questions about, and noticing that, not all countries have great manufacturing capabilities, even in the Western world. And so you start relying on other countries. And how do you work together with other countries? When one country stands to gain by vaccinating their own people, obviously, and not sharing, but then it becomes problematic if new variants arise, which is what's happening now. How do you go about doing that? And who do you talk with? And how do governments kind of bid on these vaccines? Who gets left out? Who doesn't get a chance to bid? Lots of interesting conversations that my students had around that first one. Not only are the impacts of COVID-19 exacerbated by inequality, but those same disadvantaged people will have less access to costly or scarce vaccines. And they talked about how initiatives as a solution, really initiatives were needed in order to, consider access for vaccines at a much lower cost. And how do we do that? And who's responsible for that? And how can we ensure it happens? Are there any, checkpoints of authority and power in decision making? So that was a link between socioeconomics, society, public health, and vaccinations. In the second slide that I have, where we're taking a look at some of the finer points, little harder again to get the bigger picture, but hopefully you can see all the connections in there. We'll start with the one on the left, which was connecting my students who were interested in film and the kind of the growth of Netflix as a company, as well as issues with small filmmakers and kind of local businesses with economics, and highlighting the connection between these increased power of multinational conglomerates and how it can really be very damaging for local business people or smaller shops to maintain and kind of float their finances through such a long shutdown and the supply chain being impacted around the world. So this was really, she had viewed it specifically through the lens of filmmakers, but the story can be extrapolated well beyond when you think about supply chain. And the one on the right was connecting between healthcare, public health, vaccinations, skepticism, and economics. And I felt that this particular comment really gets to the heart about what science is. It's continuous change. And with new data comes new conclusions, small tweaks, sometimes large ones. And I felt that this really encapsulated some of the issues that we have when it comes to a global pandemic that changes from day to day or week to week or month to month, but constant news coverage. And people think that science shouldn't change that much, but indeed it does. So our constantly changing understanding of this virus and its impact is the reason why vaccine development can take so long. We need to know the disease to combat it. Now, this particular comment, I did this at the very beginning of the school year. So while we have a vaccine now, the idea about changing science and our changing of our understanding of the vaccine, as well as the new variants and the virus itself, is still quite relevant. So from that, I wanted to highlight that the students at this point in time were looking at solutions and taking action. And I had asked them both of these sets of questions, how they could take a look at those intersections on the map, reflect on those maps, and think about when we move into this post-pandemic world, what are the ways that we could make our school community more effective, more efficient, ethical, and beautiful? And I focused really on the idea about ethics in terms of equity, and I asked them to consider the idea about inclusivity, because every school is presently struggling with really ensuring that students have their needs met in a digital learning environment, but also in a physical learning environment. This is something that the students are well aware of at many schools, and is worth highlighting. Additionally, I asked them to consider what actions they would take. For the most part, their responses were as you would be imagining in their inner circle about washing their hands and keeping their social distance and all of that. But it got quite interesting when I asked them to consider about their local community, and that included their sports and school and the Netherlands and the world at large. What actions should the country take? Should the world take? What should be done? How can we come together in order to deal with these issues that they had brought up in their map, which was fascinating what they were coming up with. Obviously, not all of their suggestions are going to come to fruition. They don't have the government power to make it happen, but the conversations were really rich, and it was encouraging to hear some of the ideas that they were coming up with. So with that, I thought that we might just take a quick look at some of the other maps. I think that is the next slide, if I'm not mistaken. There are two slides. The first one is Ebola. And again, this was done a couple years ago. And the students, you can see a similar map. And they decided to explore culture in terms of burial rites and language barriers to communicating, some of the ways that Ebola is spread, as well as more women than men were dying of Ebola. Why? They wanted to know quite a lot about economics, cost of hazmat suits, and the Western approach at medicine and science, and how that came with quite an abrupt, unwelcome when you have to not do your burial rituals and the things that you would like to do with your loved ones. So that was quite interesting. And for the next one, it was Zika. Also, they were very interested in exploring the cultural aspect and the inequality that became extremely evident in this particular infectious disease issue. Culture seems to be something they really are drawn to. When we look at infectious disease, every single time I've done that, even with HIV/AIDS, the culture of the people involved have been something that my students have always been curious about. But they also explored medicine, virology, politics is another one that always comes up, finances and whatnot. So I think with that, we're going to switch to Veronica for a brief moment before we come back, and I'll talk a little bit more about what my students had done.
Thank you so much, Emily. It is always so inspiring for me to hear you describe your work and to watch you teach. I think that we have so much to learn from you in terms of this thing that I call this, arc that you have designed, that I have been following now since the Ebola arc, since the Ebola map, looking at the impact on students of what you do with this map approach, which I have come to call signature pedagogy in global education, because I think that it has a few qualities that are just so powerful and so important as we think about preparing our kids for the world. So when we think about global competence as like a capacity to examine local, global, intercultural issues, to understand the different perspectives, to value others' perspectives, to engage in open and appropriate, dialogue or interactions with people, and to take action to try to solve some of these problems. I think that you touch in a very, very gentle and profound way in each one of these qualities of thinking and of being in the world that we're hoping to nurture among our youth, giving them agency. So this is a design in which the kids are the ones doing the constructing. They're the ones engaging personally. They're the ones doing so much of the work. I think that this particular mapping pedagogy that you have designed and perfected over time also has such a powerful opportunity to help us think about the kind of learning that we're after. So we're learning, you're inviting us, and you invited us in this conversation to think about ourselves as whole human beings. This is not about the facts about what is a virus and how it is defined, or it's not about just the information. You really invited us to put ourselves in that room, in that red room. So the learning is very experiential. So not only in this interaction, but also with your students, you really take the student as a whole, sort of cognitively, emotionally. You care about empathy. You care about ethical development. You care about civic development of youth. So that's very powerful, I think, in this mapping design. So if you're thinking about learning as a whole, learning for the whole child, the whole young person, you're also thinking about learning that is relevant. And there's no question. We're all talking about thinking, living the consequences of. So you're not needing to convince young people about the importance of what you do. It's relevant, visibly relevant, tactable, palpable, palpably relevant, And so I think that there you have young people who are already ready to make transfers to the world because they see this inside and outside the classroom. Sort of COVID permeates your classroom, your Zoom, the life of young people. So this creates enormous opportunities for transfer, for using what they learn in school, in their lives, to lead better lives. I'm also struck by the fact that you're inviting young people to do deep learning, sort of learning in the disciplines, really digging into the research areas, but also to be like refine and craft questions. How many times do we focus on generating or nurturing young people's capacity to ask good questions? It is not the same to ask the question of how many beds do we have in a particular hospital, or how many parts does a virus have. It matters to ask questions that are profound. How do viruses reproduce? What kinds of intersections into defense mechanisms and communication mechanisms of viruses can we learn in order to create vaccines? These kinds of sort of deeper questions. Who is in charge of deciding who is a frontline worker? So these are questions that tap into our ethics, tap into the possibilities of solutions, and you're inviting young people to say that perhaps the first question that comes to mind is not the best one, that one might want to spend some time thinking about the kinds of questions. To that, then you invite young people to respond also with depth. Not only the question becomes deeper, but also the responses. And you do that in a beautiful way, I think, when it comes to interdisciplinary and quality interdisciplinary work, because the question is very genuine. This is not a question that comes out of the textbook. These are not questions that come out of the right answer to something that you might have in mind. These are questions that are genuine questions from your students. But then you say, okay, so who are the experts who can help us understand these questions? At this point, the students begin to see that understanding science, understanding political science, understanding anthropology, understanding religion is a tool, is a lens that illuminates, is a light that we can shed onto the questions and the issues that they care about. They have some perspective, that others have perspectives, and negotiating, calibrating their understanding by looking at these perspectives. And I think that quality interdisciplinary teaching and learning involves exactly that, having very clear, purposeful questions that guide it, having clear grounding in multiple disciplines, and having really powerful intersections. And I love the fact that you spend some time at these intersections to see, is there anything? I remember in the Ebola cases, there are solutions about responding to Ebola that come from understanding the culture and the belief system and the rituals. How do we? And today with COVID and some of the responses of your students, is there something that we need to understand about the nature of science as constantly provisional and evolving, and at the same time well-rooted, and juxtaposing that with the misinformation about science and the conflicts and the discrediting of science? And can we really look into how the cognition of understanding science and understanding and making sense of information intersects with our real understanding of science and the politics behind that? I think that the way in which you are designing these maps, enabling young people not only to embrace very complex issues, but also to give them the agency to envision solutions. I think it's just brilliant. As you know, I'm a big admirer of this work, and I think it is terrific watching young people respond to what you do. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you, and for your years of support as well. So, as Veronica was saying, the kind of the arc of this was really to facilitate my students having an entry point to this really complicated, issue where we don't know all the answers, and we still don't have all the answers, and we're not going to have all the answers, but an entry point to a dialogue, and then taking that starting point in whatever direction they wanted to explore, but doing it in a focused way by asking good questions and considering the perspectives of who might be best to answer that question, and then beyond. And so this, this could go on for quite a while, but there are only so many lessons that you have to donate to an exploration that really should take a lot of time. But I did, wrap it up. But I wrapped it up on what I thought would be a way for them to consider a little bit more of the positive, because there's so many things that are just horrible to read when you're talking about infectious disease or some really complex global issues like inequality and whatnot. But I asked them to think about what they've learned, and I asked them for some incidences of hope. So in this last slide that I would like to share with you, what I asked them to do is to reflect. Right? And there are a couple ways that you could do this with your own students. I did not have them create a dialogue, my own students, but if they were at the level where they were working on creative writing or exploring perspective in general, I might have considered doing this. What I had them do was really consider the arc of what they have learned. And I used to think, but now I think thinking routine for me is nice and open-ended, and is always something that rolls really smoothly into considering or helping the students consider the learning that they've done. And this was after reflecting on the map as a whole. So I did ask them to do this, and I also asked them to consider their hope. I didn't ask them to write a story, but I asked them to create a quick message specifically for our school community, because I feel like we needed it very greatly. And so if you have a little, a hope that you would like to share in the chat, please feel free. You can also keep that hope to yourself. I certainly hope and would like to share some of my hopes from my students, that we would be able to be in person from, whatever the now on was or is, as well as I'm very hopeful that vaccination continues to roll out very smoothly and becomes more smooth in countries that it's presently not going well in. And my students had hopes about vaccination. They had a lot of hope about prom and graduation, and they were really trying to hope about their first year at university for sure. Mixed messages on whether they wanted their diploma exams or not, but that's normal. But those were their messages of hope for the community, that we would get through this, and they were thinking positive. Thank you for the comments of the process. I'm hopeful that even if it doesn't have to be anything related to infectious disease or science, but we will share the link to the collections at the end. Please feel free to copy the whole thing, delete what doesn't apply to you, add in, mix, match, whatever it is. This is only here for you to consider what this might look like in your own classroom and in your own context, in your own grade level. An interesting question about COVID-19 and bikes. We were in and out of in-person learning, so they did quite a lot of things on their own. But I'm sure that they are on their bikes and doing their learning. So I will give a brief minute just in case anyone wanted to share their hopes. I'll read out the ones that they are shared. I hope that we will all protect not only our own loved ones, but to care for our community, regardless of what the future holds. Absolutely. Oh boy, the idea of looking beyond, like within our family group, but beyond into the greater community and the greater good, especially as we see disparities in vaccination, even within our own country and the rest of the world. How can we look forward to doing what we need to do and encouraging others to do the same. Thank you for sharing that. I don't know if Veronica or Philippa have any hopes to share. I'm sorry for putting you on the spot if you don't.
I hope that we can continue to learn. I think that this pandemic has put us all in a learning path, a very rapid learning path, and I hope that we can solidify the ethics of what we've learned this time around, and be prepared to act more cooperatively as we move forward, always with an open mind to continue to learn. How about you, Philippa? What do you hope?
You know, when you've been speaking about the whole child, I've noticed as you have both been talking that I'm also feeling a bit like the whole teacher. And I keep thinking, what can I do? How can I better what I do? And so I guess my hope is that also, I think this has been a time of introspection for a lot of people. And I hope that we do come out the other side with people trying to make the world better.
Thank you both for sharing your hopes. As we round out, if there are any questions that you might have that you want to share, or if you have anything to put in the chat, please feel free. Don't know if there's anything else that Tess or Philippa wanted to say, or Veronica.
Do you want to share the collection? The link to the collection. Okay.
So this is the entire arc of what we did. So there's one collection, and there are 4 different collections housed inside of it, of each of the steps. So the first collection is really about, getting curious and considering perspectives, and then moving forward and driving into inquiry, and then about solutions. Part 2 is inquiring, asking questions, and mapping. Part 3 is solutions, and different, solutions with the arts, and including Chef Jose Andres. And then the part 3 is reflections. And so these were the different either dialogues or thinking routines. And there's a children's book there that is free to download and is in some ridiculous number of languages, 40, 50, something like this, that has been translated in. And it's all free ebook downloadable, excuse me. And it is stories of hope from around the world. So I thought it was a nice way to bring some of the larger issues and questions that our younger citizens might have to the table. So the link is in the chat. Again, feel free to copy, edit, change, do whatever works for you.
Do we have any questions for Emily or Veronica? I would like to take this opportunity. You both have been so amazing. I'm so inspired. Thank you so much for presenting today and helping us put all this together and think about the future from this year that we've had. So
happy to share. Absolutely. Thank you for the Learning Lab. This is such an amazing resource. I don't know what I would do without it.
I was going to say exactly the same thing. Thank you for the Learning Lab. It's just such an incredible opportunity, right, for us in education to have access to incredible resources, and then to have the agency of curating and putting things together in the ways in which we think will help our students. So thanks for that, Philippa, and the whole team. Tess, thank you too for being the magician around everything.
Thank you, Tess. So thank you
participants as well. Sorry, Philippa.
No, it's okay.
I'll steal your thunder. But thank you very much for those of you who came to listen and participate.
Exactly. That was, So thank you everyone for coming. Check out our education, our help page on the Learning Lab for future events. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Take care, everyone.